All right, thank you, Brian. Thank you to the Kansas City Public Library and to the History Department and the College of Arts and Sciences at UMKC. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you tonight. I'm going to read my paper. It's going to take about 46 minutes and 23 seconds. All right? So don't start your clock until I start. In 1928, Walter Benjamin published a long essay entitled One-Way Street, composed of a set of fragmentary meditations upon his times. The essay takes the form of a walk down a city street and records impressions, thoughts, provocations, and inspirations at stops along the way. In the room where he eats breakfast, Benjamin considers the mystical properties of dreams retold before coffee. At the newsstand, he notes the proliferation of brochures and magazines and wonders if the history of the book will outlast the 20th century. As he passes the sandwich board man walking a line up and down the street, Benjamin comments on the terrible eloquence of the placard on the man's chest in an era of increasingly disposable human labor. On sale. At the post office, he imagines the collector's empire of stamps where kings and queens are reordered according to denomination and defaced by cancellation. Sitting on a park bench, he experiences the soothing sensation of overhearing a whispered conversation in a foreign tongue. Back at home again in his study, he wishes that the words would flow as easily from his pen as the smoke from his cigarette. But it is with Benjamin's visit to the fortune teller that I want to begin tonight. Arriving at the entrance to her parlor, marked by a sign that reads Madame Ariane, second courtyard on the left, he reflects on the character of time. He who asks the fortune teller the future unwittingly forfeits an inner intimation of coming events that is 1,000 times more exact than anything they may say. Benjamin uses the phrase presence of mind to describe what he means. Presence of mind is an extract of the future and precise awareness of the present moment that is more decisive than foreknowledge of the most distant events. Presence of mind for Benjamin is a way of taking the measure of a place at a moment in time, making a present reading of the evidence of the past in order to imagine the likely course of the future. It is a mode of thinking that it is once historical, prophetic, and actively engaged in the fullness of the moment. And it is an achievement that is a bodily as much as a mental art. It is a sort of understanding that comes from walking down the street. The street that I want to walk along tonight with you is West Florissant Avenue in Ferguson, Missouri. South of the burned-out Quick Trip and the famous McDonald's, south of the intersection with Chambers, south almost to the city limit. There at the corner of Ferguson Avenue and West Florissant. There, on August the 5th of 2014, Emerson Electric announced third quarter sales of $6.3 billion, down about 1% from the second quarter, but undergirded by a record backlog of orders. A quarter mile to the northeast, 4 days later, Officer Darren Wilson killed Michael Brown. Ferguson police just executed my unarmed son, read a placard held by Brown's stepfather, Lewis Head, as he walked back and forth at the scene. While the distance between the spot on Canfield Drive, where Michael Brown died, and the corporate headquarters of Emerson Electric is so small that the shots fired by Officer Wilson must have been audible in the company lunchroom, I do not want to draw too direct a line between them. I do not want to suggest that Emerson Electric is responsible for the murder of Michael Brown, at least not according to any conventional understanding of responsibility. I do, however, want to use the proximity of Emerson's corporate headquarters and the shooting of Michael Brown to suggest some questions about the ways that the relationship between the past and the future in the United States of America is hedged in, limited, and perhaps even determined by histories and habits of mind that shape and degrade the decisions we make. Before I begin, I need to say one other thing. I am not a trained expert in the history of the 20th century. urban history, or even the history of St. Louis. But the history I'm going to be talking about tonight is my history, the history that I have lived through as an American, a Missourian, and a white person. It is a history that I have helped to make, one that I have contested, but also one from which I have benefited. It is my own history, as well as our common future, that I want to discuss with you tonight. In the months after Officer Wilson shot Michael Brown, the nation was drawn into the sort of procedural drama familiar to citizens of the televisual republic. On the one hand, we were told the story of how a large and out-of-control black man made a white police officer feel as frightened, quote, as a 5-year-old child, fearful enough to make his subsequent use of deadly force seem to him, at least, reasonable. On the other hand, the story of a bad apple cop with racist intentions and indifferent, at best, prosecutor with a too cozy relationship to the police. Both stories follow the format outlined by the criminal justice system in the United States and its countless fictional avatars. They were stories that attempted to weigh intentions and actions, causes and effects, justifiability and culpability. They focused on the states of consciousness that determined the course of events in the 90 seconds between the time that Officer Wilson pulled up alongside Michael Brown in the middle of Canfield Drive and the time that he fired the last of the 12 shots that left Brown bleeding out in the street. Neither the proceduralist silo of the true crime drama nor the history of the Jim Crow-style racism that inevitably shapes our understanding of any encounter between a white police officer and a young black man in the United States fully describes the social, economic, and legal subjection of black people in Ferguson, in St. Louis, in the state of Missouri, and in the nation more generally. Understanding that requires us to look backwards from the 90 seconds on Canfield Drive to the 90 years of the entrenchment of white privilege and black disadvantage that preceded it. Historian George Lipsett's essay, if you're going to read one thing after this, read this essay. Historian George Lipsett's essay, The Possessive Investment in Whiteness, provides a detailed accounting of the ways that white freedom has been extracted from black abjection in the 20th century. Beginning with the whites-only character of the charter documents of the American middle class, the GI Bill, the Social Security Act, the Federal Housing Act, and following them up through the history of restricted covenants, redlining, blockbusting, anti-busing, urban renewal, and federally subsidized suburbanization, most notably in the form of the interstate highway system, Lipsitz chronicles the history by which black neighborhoods were downgraded, degraded, and in many cases simply destroyed during the 20th century. United States urban policy, Lipsitz shows, has consistently, indeed unerringly, promoted both segregation and white privilege. In 1924, the National Association of Real Estate Brokers ratified a code of ethics that enjoined members in good standing from, quote, introducing into a neighborhood members of a race or nationality whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. And in the years between 1934 and 1962, the Federal Housing Agency raised the realtor's rule to a principle of governance by financing $120 billion of new housing in the United States of America, less than 2% of which was available to non-white families. For many of these years, the FHA required restrictive covenants, a buyer's written promise to resell a house only to another white person as a precondition of the loans that they made to home buyers in all-white suburbs. In 1964, Congress explicitly exempted the FHA from the terms of the Civil Rights Act, and the federally created redlining maps of the 1940s and 1950s continued to be used by private bankers to deny black home buyers credit or to charge them exorbitant rates through the 1970s. In 1968, Congress passed a Fair Housing Act that had been methodically stripped of any enforcement mechanism. In the 4 decades after the Second World War, 1,600 black neighborhoods were destroyed by, quote, urban renewal projects that subsidized downtown office buildings and traffic corridors designed to create bypass routes for the white suburbanites who commuted in and out of central cities every day. When housing prices shot up in the 1970s, white homeowners, the indirect legatees of decades of boundary-marking violence and direct beneficiaries of 40 years of discriminatory federal policy, realized huge gains in equity. Gains that low taxes on inherited wealth and the ability to step up the estimated value of inherited property before paying capital gains taxes allowed them to pass on to their heirs. The history of 20th century St. Louis, Missouri does not so much follow the historical arc of the possessive investment in whiteness as it exemplifies that history in extremis. By most measures, St. Louis today is one of the 3 or 4 most segregated cities in the United States of America. One of 15 or so cities that the urban sociologists Doug Massey and Nancy Denton termed hyper-segregated in their classic American apartheid. These are cities in which African Americans can go months at a time without seeing a white person in their neighborhoods, apart, of course, from the policemen patrolling their beats, or, as we will see, municipal court judges collecting fines. The modern history of racial segregation in St. Louis might be said to begin with the city's 1916 law establishing separate neighborhoods for blacks and whites, and the 1917 white supremacist pogrom in East St. Louis. In the 19th century, St. Louis had been one of the nation's least segregated cities. But during the First World War, thousands of blacks from Louisiana and Mississippi took the Illinois Central northward in search of industrial jobs in cities like St. Louis. During the spring of 1917, 2,000 blacks a week were said to be arriving in St. Louis. And in May of that year, white working men rampaged through black neighborhoods in and near the city, killing as many as 200 people and burning the buildings that housed 6,000 others. In those early years, the black residents of St. Louis were legally barred from moving into certain neighborhoods and concentrated in the downtown area, a pattern that was maintained even after the end of legal residential segregation through sporadic but consistent violence against black families who moved into, quote, white neighborhoods. Those years provided the racial template the city of St. Louis has maintained down to the present day. In the years between 1943 and 1960, mostly white St. Louis County received 5 times as many FHA loans as did the racially mixed city of St. Louis. As whites moved further out from the city, especially westward towards St. Charles County, I-70 was expanded to serve them. In the same years, the city of St. Louis, again with federal support, embarked upon a program of urban renewal, which involved the bulldozing of some of the city's oldest black neighborhoods and the replacement with office buildings, to which the increasingly suburbanized middle-class workforce commuted every day along an ever-expanding number of federally funded lanes of interstate. Longtime St. Louis civil rights activist Ivory Perry termed these twin programs of urban redevelopment and highway expansion, quote, black removal with white approval. As both federal and local authorities tried to build subsidized housing to provide for the city's mostly African American displaced population, as well as for the growing number of St. Louis residents seeking affordable housing outside the city limits, the white population of St. Louis County organized itself into neighborhood improvement associations, which sponsored restrictive covenants, collusive whites-only real estate markets, the buying up of empty property lots, the buying out of black homeowners, and most importantly in St. Louis, restrictive zoning laws. The map of the St. Louis metropolitan area is pasted over with what the leading historian of the city has termed, quote, postage stamp municipalities, Small cities, many of which were founded as vehicles for the white inhabitants of the unincorporated areas of St. Louis County to pass residential zoning codes banning multifamily units and stipulating large minimum lot sizes in the face of proposals to construct low-income housing near their neighborhoods. At the turn of the 21st century, almost one-half of St. Louis County's 90-odd municipalities continue to boast of, and I use that word advisedly, black populations under 5%. The majority of St. Louis African Americans lived in a gradually expanding corridor running from the downtown area northwestward toward Ferguson and beyond. Like most of the rest of St. Louis County, mid-century Ferguson was defended by exclusionary zoning codes and whites-only collusion in the real estate market. In the 1960s, Ferguson was known as a, quote, sundown community. African Americans, mostly from neighboring Kinloch, came in to work in the homes of wealthy whites in Ferguson during the day, but were expected to be out of town by the time the sun set. To this day, the adjacent cities are joined by only 2 through streets. The Ferguson city line runs down a neutral zone lined on either side with mirror image 3-way intersections. If you have flown into St. Louis, you have likely landed in Kinloch. Over the last 3 decades, the vast majority of that city's black residents have been displaced to accommodate the expansion of Lambert St. Louis Airport. Over the same period of time, a small number of African American homeowners and a much larger number of African American renters have gradually replaced whites in Ferguson. Ferguson, which was almost entirely white in 1970, today has a black majority. Thanks to the Arch City Defender's white paper on the municipal courts in North St. Louis County, Radley Balco's extraordinary reporting in the Washington Post, ongoing litigation in the Missouri courts against, quote, policing for profit, and finally the Justice Department's report on the Ferguson Police Department, we now have a picture of the extraordinary climate of police harassment that culminated in the murder of Michael Brown. In Ferguson, during the year 2013, 86% of traffic stops involved black motorists. This in spite of the fact that the population of the city is only 67% black, and that its roads are daily driven by a high number of white commuters. After being stopped, blacks were twice as likely to be searched and twice as likely to be arrested as were whites. This in spite of the fact that in the event of a search, whites proved to be 2/3 more likely to be caught with some kind of contraband. Following upon these citations, the city issued over 9,000 arrest warrants for missed court appearances and unpaid fines. Occurrences which, it should be said, were a statistical certainty when notices were sent by mail to a housing insecure population. Citizens who failed to appear in court at the appointed time or to pay fines that were, according to the Arch City Defenders, quote, frequently tripled their monthly income, were liable to be jailed, sometimes for as much as 3 weeks as they awaited a municipal court date. Those with outstanding warrants were likewise rendered ineligible for most forms of public assistance and government-provided social services. In some ways, Ferguson's pattern of racist policing is reminiscent of famously abusive police practices like CompStat and Stop and Frisk. But while these notorious practices were framed by a theory of preemption, a theory that treated every young black man as a potential low-level offender and every low-level offender as a potential felon, policing in Ferguson and many neighboring municipalities seems to have been focused less on preventing hypothetical future crimes than on extracting revenue from an already impoverished community. Ferguson's law enforcement practices are shaped by the city's focus on revenue rather than public safety needs, the Justice Department concluded in a March 2015 report on Ferguson's police department. The report found that the boundary between the fiscal and police functions of the city government of Ferguson had completely broken down. The city manager and the police chief had discussed using tickets to meet revenue benchmarks, and police officers were being evaluated on the basis of their ticket pushing, and this is a quote, productivity. In 2013, the city of Ferguson earned $2,635,400 from municipal court fines, which accounted for 20% of the city budget, the second largest revenue share drawn from any single revenue source. Absolutely, they don't want nothing but your money, the Arch Defender's white paper quotes one defendant as saying. It's ridiculous how small municipalities make their lifeline off the blood of the people, said another. It's an ordinance made up for them, said still another. It's not a law, it's an ordinance. The city of Ferguson, its white mayor, its majority white city council, its almost totally white police force, and its white municipal court judge was farming its poor and working class black population for revenue. Cantoned according to the laws and practices of a white supremacist real estate market, the black inhabitants of Ferguson were rendered available for a final round of resource extraction that threatened in many cases to dispossess them entirely, as excessive fines and exclusion from necessary social services and public housing combined to turn them out onto the streets. The killing of the jaywalking Michael Brown was an acute example of the chronic exploitation, harassment, debt bondage, and wanton bankrupting of the city of Ferguson's African American population. As James Baldwin memorably put it about the United States in general, it is extremely expensive to be poor in Ferguson. The Department of Justice traced all of this back to a lack of training, supervision, and oversight, exacerbated by shoddy record keeping and clear racial bias. It documented the systemic racism of the Ferguson Police Department. Its report on the Ferguson Police Department is almost unprecedented in its critical attention to racist police practice in the United States of America. As such, it raised what had long been the common sense understanding of police in poor and African American communities across the country. It took that and raised it to a principle of public policy. But the report stopped short of providing a structural analysis of racist policing in Ferguson. Put simply, to begin with, why was the city government reverting to medieval modes of revenue extraction at the same time that Emerson Electric was doing $24 billion a year of business out of its Ferguson headquarters? Or, to put the question in terms that lead us from the intentions of police officers and city fathers backwards towards the incentives that structure the choices they make. The choice to raise revenue by writing thousands of tickets. The choice to pull over this black motorist rather than that white motorist. The choice to stop a black teenager for wearing his pants too low or having his hood up or walking down the middle of the street. The choice to shoot him dead after he has run away. The choice to leave his body lying on a putrid street for 4 hours in the summer heat. What larger interests are expressed in and exposed by these choices? In Ferguson, the answer lies in a historical amalgam of the possessive investment in whiteness, corporate privilege, fiscal conservatism, and misguided efforts to use economic development to promote social equality. Again, Ferguson, St. Louis County, and Missouri are not so much unique as they are extreme. They provide an exemplary account of the way that state and local governments think about economic development, about what economic development is, how they define it, and even social equality, and the way that corporations do business in the United States of America today. Municipal tax revenue in the state of Missouri is limited by the state constitution. With very few exceptions, which we will very shortly discuss, any increase of local taxes, licenses, or fees must be approved by a citywide referendum. This constitutional limitation dates to 1980, the inaugural date of the Reagan Revolution and the high watermark of Missouri's own variant of state shrinking fiscal conservatism, as represented by Representative Mel Hancock and his Taxpayer Survival Association. The mixture of melodrama, self-pity, and entitlement suggested by the organization's title reflects its roots in the broad-based social movement that emerged in the late 1970s to defend white caste privilege that had been carefully built up over the past half-century. Along with gun licenses, which are explicitly exempted from the provisions of the Hancock Amendment, municipal fines provide Missouri cities with one of the few sources of revenues they can expand without a referendum. The Hancock Amendment and other similar laws in other states radically constrain the possibilities of municipal governance in much of the United States of America. Unable to raise taxes in order to raise revenue, municipal governments have another tool at their disposal: lowering them. Unable to raise money, they can still give it away. Take Emerson Electric. On July the 27th, 2009, Emerson opened a brand new $50 million flagship data center on its Ferguson campus. Subsequent press reports about the data center were filled with numbers. 100 dignitaries at the ribbon cutting, including Missouri Governor Jay Nixon. 35,000 square feet, 550 solar panels, $100,000 in annual energy savings for the company. The ability to withstand a magnitude 8.0 earthquake. They noted how many people Emerson employed globally, nationally, and in the St. Louis metropolitan area. Although the number of people who might eventually be employed in the new data center itself was hard to find. In fact, a state-of-the-art data center might eventually employ about 24 people, none of whom were guaranteed to live in or anywhere near Ferguson. The economic function of a data center, after all, is to eliminate clerical workers, not to provide them with jobs. But the most remarkable missing number of all was the amount of property tax revenue the county and the city housing this state-of-the-art profit generator would gain from its construction. In 2014, the assessed valuation of real and personal property on Emerson's entire 152-acre, seven-building campus was roughly $15 million. One might ask, what happened to the $50 million data center? That value has gone up and down over the last several years as Emerson has sold off some buildings and built others, but it has not exceeded $15 million in the period since the data center was completed. So what happened to that brand new $50 million building? One explanation would be if Emerson had received a Chapter 353 local real property tax abatement to support the construction of the building. For the past 50 years, cities in the St. Louis area have been using these abatements to encourage new development in areas designated as, quote, enhanced enterprise zones. This is all Missouri state law. Companies locating in such a zone get certain tax incentives. One of these incentives, according to the state, is a 10-year real estate tax abatement. That means a $50 million data center built in one of these zones would be allowed to remain all but invisible for tax purposes for the first decade of its existence. After that, its appraisal value would be halved for the next 15 years. Indeed, in 2008, the St. Louis Economic Development Partnership announced that the data center was being built within a state-designated enhanced enterprise zone, and Emerson has received state tax abatements that are limited to corporations receiving local property tax abatements. Emerson, however, denies that it received tax abatements to support the center's construction. According to company spokesman Mark Polzin, quote, "None of our campus real estate is under abatement." Polzin told me that Emerson has foregone tax abatements for which it is eligible out of a concern for fairness. We never availed ourselves as such. We felt that our real property had already been fairly assessed historically by St. Louis County. According to Emerson, the company is voluntarily paying more taxes than required by law. It might seem improbable to at least one member of the audience. It might seem improbable that a corporation would forego any tax break to which it was legally entitled. Indeed, it might seem a violation of that corporation's fiduciary responsibility to its shareholders. Polzin's explanation, however, is both plausible and fascinating. Emerson didn't need the abatement because its taxes were already low enough. At the very least, this raises important questions about the assessment value of property in St. Louis County, about, put another way, the structural aspect of the political economy of St. Louis. For tax purposes, Emerson's Ferguson campus is appraised according to, quote, its fair market value. This means that a $50 million solar-powered data center is only worth what someone else would be willing to pay for it. And there just aren't that many people out there in the market for one. Polzin went even further. Our location in Ferguson affects the fair market value of the entire campus. By this reasoning, the condition of West Florissant Avenue explains the low valuation of the company's headquarters rather than the other way around. However one accounts for it, there is little question that the low valuation severely limits the tax money that Emerson contributes to the government of St. Louis County and to the Ferguson-Florissant District's struggling schools. That's real estate taxes are generally earmarked for school support. On a side note, Michael Brown graduated from nearby Normandy High School, a nearly 100% African-American school that has been operating without state accreditation for the last 4 years and sits within a tax cashment area occupied by the gleaming silver headquarters of Express Scripts, currently the largest corporation in Missouri and one which, as far as I can tell, pays no property tax at all. Of the 25 parcels Emerson owns all around St. Louis County, it pays the county $1.3 million in property taxes. The city of Ferguson itself receives far less. Even after a 2013 property tax increase from 65% to the state minimum of $1 per $100 of assessed value, Ferguson received at most $68,000 in property taxes from the corporate headquarters that occupies 152 acres of its tax base. Not even enough to pay the municipal judge and his clerk to hand out the fines and sign the arrest warrants. Emerson Electric isn't the only business on Ferguson's West Florissant Avenue. The street is also home to a number of big box stores, including a Home Depot, a Walmart, and a Sam's Club, located at the city's northern limit. These companies all came to town in 1997 through something called tax increment financing, known, to the extent that it's known at all, by the acronym TIF. Along with low appraisals and tax abatements, Tif Districts are one of Missouri's principal tools for encouraging economic development. It works like this. A community like Ferguson wants to bring more money into its economy and increase its property values. So it designates a Tif district and borrows money by selling municipal bonds. These funds are most often used, the funds that it gains from selling the bonds, are most often used to make the area more attractive to businesses, clearing old buildings, adding roads, upgrading infrastructure. All of this is based on the assumption that the new commercial development will bring a certain amount of revenue, of tax revenue, in the form of rising property values on adjacent parcels, increased revenue from sales taxes, and so forth. That revenue will be used to retire the bonds that funded the TIF. In theory, these incentives do not cost taxpayers any money. Cities issue these bonds feeling confident that the new businesses will generate more than enough revenue to pay their money back. The problem is that the amount that the city must pay each year is locked in at the beginning of the bond issue. If the increased revenue is not as high as expected in any given year, the city finds itself in the red. Tax increment financing is a way of indenturing municipalities to their own hypothetical economic development. Like any other municipal bond, TIF bonds are ultimately secured by the ability of the issuer to raise revenue. In this case, by Ferguson's ability to tax and fine its citizens in order to pay off the bonds it has issued. If the revenue falls short of projection, the debt has to be covered by the local citizens. Not by the banks. They're insulated because they have not loaned money directly to the underperforming retailers. And not by the retailers. They're protected because the city has paid for the capital improvement of the area, limiting their sunk cost investment. It's the taxpayers and fine payers who have to make up the difference. And in Ferguson, that's precisely what happened. The Halls Ferry TIF in Ferguson, the one that was used to underwrite the construction of the big box stores on West Florissant Avenue, was originally valued at $8 million. Over the last several years, however, the revenue generated by the Tif District has not been sufficient to cover the bond. And TIF's specific deficits, $43,000 in 2012, for instance, had to be covered with taxpayer money. Not all TIFs fail to match projections. As it happens, there is also a successful TIF in Ferguson. Unfortunately, it demonstrates the ultimate emptiness of the rising tide's repeated promise to lift all boats. The South Florissant TIF was initiated in 2012 to build multi-use retail and residential space in Ferguson's downtown area. If it has not been entirely successful in the planning document's stated goal of establishing Ferguson as a regional destination along the lines of the Del Mar Loop, it has nevertheless supported the emergence of the sort of photo-ready pleasantness illustrated in the planning documents. And it is in the black. So what's not to like? Ferguson's downtown TIF was self-consciously designed to provide a front door for the city's subsequent economic development. But it wasn't designed to improve life for existing residents. Its proponents envisioned an artery of retail and residential development that would connect the city, as well as the city of Cool Valley, which was also involved in the planning, to the campus of the University of Missouri-St. Louis, and to the industrial development sprawling along I-70. But the document never addressed the disconnection of South Florissant Road from West Florissant Road. So these are two roads that run parallel up and down Ferguson. To get from the neighborhood where Michael Brown died to downtown Ferguson, one has to travel along a long, undeveloped stretch of Ferguson Avenue and then make a near 180-degree turn under a railroad bridge to merge onto another street that leads to the downtown. There are no sidewalks bordering this stretch of road, and many of those who travel it do so by walking on the shoulder. A notable issue given the risk of being cited for, quote, manner of walking in the roadway faced by black pedestrians in Ferguson. The two Fergusons mentioned by many commentators are effectively connected by the back door. All of this inverts the purpose of funding economic development through taxpayer dollars. Under Missouri laws, Tif district plans are limited to areas that have been designated as, quote, blighted by the municipality. They were designed to bring the benefits of capitalist development to areas that might otherwise be regarded as inhospitable to investment. Along with Chapter 353 tax abatements, which have a similarly framed focus on blighted areas, TIF bonds were designed to use the market economy to push forward the not yet realized project of racial equality in the United States. In the event, however, these tools have often been turned inside out, used to generalize the risk of investment to the entire population of a city while concentrating their financial benefits in small tracts of development. The final twist in this story is an extraordinary one. Under the Hancock Amendment, municipalities can raise their sales taxes without a local referendum in order to pay for the retirement of TIF bonds. And according to the Ferguson city budget, sales taxes account for the largest share of that city's revenue. Next comes municipal court fines, and after that, franchise taxes, taxes on telecommunications, natural gas, and electricity usage. Only after that comes revenue from property taxes. Taken together, these regressive taxes account for almost 60%. A regressive tax is a tax which falls proportionally more heavily on people with less money, right? Account for almost 60% of the city's revenue. In contrast, property taxes, which are at least in theory progressive taxes, account for just under 12%. The wealth of the city, scarcely taxed at all, is locked up in property that African Americans were prevented from buying for most of its history. Economic development in the United States of America often turns out to have the bare meaning of, quote, getting large businesses to locate their buildings within the city limits. And in St. Louis County, this race to the bottom is turbocharged by the postage stamp pattern of municipal governance, a legacy of the era of suburban segregation, which makes it astoundingly easy for businesses to pit municipalities against one another by threatening short-haul moves in search of the best possible deal. What, after all, does Walmart have to lose by moving 400 yards down the road to a brand new Tif district in another town? These factors, the drastic underassessment of corporate wealth, the indenture of municipal government to corporate development, the unequal allocation of risk and benefit between municipalities and the improvement districts they contain, are not unique to Ferguson. The legal constraints, the development tools they have spawned, and the negative consequence of their over-misapplication exist in many other cities in the United States. That is why I refer to them as aspects of the structural rather than intentional racism. History and the standing order have left those who seek to govern American cities with only bad choices. Thus, to say that the recent history of Ferguson exemplifies the history of structural racism or the enhancement and defense of the possessive investment in whiteness is not necessarily to say that the Ferguson city government itself has been especially craven, characterized by poor decision-making or a high degree of self-dealing. As it happens, however, the Ferguson city government has been especially craven, characterized by poor decision-making and a high degree of self-dealing. Faced with only bad choices, the Ferguson city government repeatedly made disgraceful ones. The Ferguson city budget for fiscal year 2013-2014 opened on a cautious note. The city, it noted, had not, quote, recovered from the loss of $1.5 million of annual tax revenue dating back to the financial crisis, which began in St. Louis County in 2006. And yet the government of the city of Ferguson chose to respond with a campaign of unparalleled spending on, well, the government of the city of Ferguson. In the 2 years before the protests on West Florissant Avenue, the city of Ferguson built a new $8 million fire station, issued bonds to fund the portion of a $3.5 million renovation of the police station, and had given all of the municipal employees, almost half of whom work for the police department, an 8% raise. The city's fiscal year 2013-2014 budget also earmarked a $500,000 for the replacement of all of the city's marked police cars with brand new Chevrolet Tahoes, presumably including the one that Officer Darren Wilson was driving when he confronted Michael Brown and then shot him with one of the 60 brand new handguns the city purchased that year. So much spending on the infrastructure of municipal governance might be appropriate in a city that was running a budget surplus. But as we have seen, the city of Ferguson was relying on municipal traffic fines to close the gap between its growing expenditures and its declining revenue. In a final twist, and I will finish here, it turns out that the city of Ferguson has been using its downtown TIF bond to fund the renovation of the Ferguson Police Department and the expansion of the municipal courts complex. Now, the police station and the court complex may be downtown, but they do not generate revenue, at least not of the sort that is earmarked for the repayment of the TIF bond. Of course, if one counts the $2.6 million in municipal tickets issued from those buildings last year, they have already, or in 2014, they have already paid for themselves. The city is using the structure of the TIF bond to move the renovation of the police department and the courts building to the front of the municipal queue. Rather than using money that had been borrowed on security by all of the citizens of Ferguson to double down on its blue ribbon police department, the city might have tried to use its TIF funds to link the downtown to the rest of the city. Perhaps they could have even built a sidewalk along Ferguson Avenue. After all, as Officer Wilson surely reminded Michael Brown before shooting him, in Ferguson, jaywalking is illegal.